and especially on low-income renters in communities of color. So research shows how the threat of housing instability impacts health, mental health, educational outcomes, and employment. And evictions, of course, also negatively affect renters' financial stability as well as future opportunities for housing. Now, critically, one thing we do in this report is to make a key distinction between eviction filings and evictions that are actually carried out or, quote, executed. And in DC, this means that the US Marshal actually arrives to a family's home. In most places, it's the local sheriff to make sure the family leaves and to change the locks. So recent research clearly demonstrates the phenomenon of serial filing. So this is where landlords file for eviction on the same tenant in the same unit multiple times a year. And my own qualitative research previously with landlords shows that these filings are often made without the intent to actually remove the tenant, as of course eviction can be quite costly to landlords in terms of turnover and vacancy. Rather, these filings are meant to put pressure on the tenant either to pay or to leave. And I think one really big open question in the literature is to what degree do we see serial filings, of course, within subsidized housing. So as a result, eviction filings are much more common in the lives of low-income renters than actual evictions, even though we tend to focus on evictions themselves, or we tend to ally the two and just talk about eviction without distinguishing between these two processes. Now, the vast majority of eviction filings, as I'll show you in a minute, don't result in the tenant being removed. Importantly, though, eviction filings have incredibly negative consequences for tenants, whether or not they result in a physical eviction. Next slide. So the data I'll draw on today come from two sources. First, we received a full set of eviction filings from the DC Superior Court system, and these records account for more than 160,000 filings over a 5-year period in the district, including every event that took place during the life of a case. And to capture information, sorry, just setting a timer so I don't talk too long. To capture information that was not included in these records, such as on the subsidy status of the tenant, the amount of rent that the tenant owed, we hand-coded and collected more than 14,000 forms that were pulled from the court website. And we also matched all of these records to property records from the Office of Tax and Revenue so that we could learn more about who owned the properties and who the landlords were and how some of these practices varied by landlord. Next slide, I'll give you just a brief overview of the key findings. So first, we find that the eviction process in DC impacts a really large number of renters. Each year, there are around 32,000 eviction filings with the court, and we find that 11% or 1 in 9 DC renters received an eviction filing in the year 2018. Many of them, as we will show, received more than one filing in a calendar year. Now, tenants in DC can be evicted for one of 10 reasons, and DC is actually much more tenant friendly than many of the other places I've studied and many of the other places we may hear about today. What our analysis shows is that 93% of all filings are for just one of these 10 reasons, and that's non-payment of rent. And this fact really underscores the enormous financial challenges that rent-burdened households encounter. So about half of all renters in the district spend more than 30% of their income on rent, and a quarter spend more than half of their income on rent. And although rental subsidies are intended to decrease the burden of rental costs and lower the risk of housing instability, we find that many renters receiving subsidies still end up with an eviction notice. So from our records, 23% of all eviction filings are for tenants who have a rental subsidy. And in this data, unfortunately, we can't distinguish between public housing and vouchers or LIHTC. This is actually just a form that likely the clerk in the courtroom fills out by asking the tenant, do you have a rental subsidy? So in future research, we really hope to be able to match this data to administrative data that will better help us disentangle exactly which types of subsidies are most protective of eviction. Finally, by comparing these rates across cities, we find that the rate of filing in the district, so the number of eviction notices filed relative to the number of renters, is among the highest for large US cities. Next slide. So this graph identifies the number of residential eviction filings filed with the court every year. Again, this is about 32,000. And between the years of our data from 2014 to 18, we really see only modest changes in the total number of eviction filings. Notably, this chart also demonstrates one of the key takeaways that we have here, which is that only a very small portion, about 5.5% or 1,700 cases that are filed with the court actually end up in an executed eviction. So you can see that in the slim blue line at the bottom of each of these bars. And the remaining green portion, about 95% of all filings on average, identifies the number of cases that do not end in a formal eviction. Most frequently in these cases, about 2/3 of the time, they end in a dismissal. And this is where the judge really finds no basis for the case at all, most often because the tenant paid the rent owed in between the time that the case was filed and that it came to court. It could also be that the tenant never owed the money to begin with. This translates to about 1 out of every 100 renter households in DC being put out of their home through a court-ordered eviction. Many others, of course, are removed informally or leave before the writ is executed in ways that we can't capture with this data set. Next slide. Now, this chart shows all of the households that received an eviction filing in 2018. And in the bar on the left, you can see that most of them, nearly 60%, received more than one filing at the same address during this time period. And this practice of filing eviction notices against a single household at the same address repeatedly is known as serial eviction filing, which I mentioned earlier. This tells us something really important. When tenants receive multiple filings a year from the same landlord at the same address, it means, of course, that tenants are not actually being evicted. This may seem obvious, but it's sort of the clearest way you can tell that most eviction filings are not resulting in an eviction. And again, most of the time, this is because the tenant paid. Now, this process of using the court system to bring eviction suits, the majority of which are dismissed and do not end in an eviction, it serves to really just overburden the court system with the cases where tenants were never really going to get evicted in the first place. They just needed a little more time to come up with the money. So it needlessly drags tenants to courts. It causes them to miss work and family obligations. And notably, it really reduces the capacity of the court to arbitrate real landlord-tenant disputes because they're flooded with cases that aren't actually going anywhere. Next slide. So moving on a little bit to talk about the geographic disparities in the pattern of eviction filings. So nearly 60% of all the filings in the city take place in wards 7 and 8. These are the wards east of the river, where the majority of residents are people of color and where the poverty rate is among the highest in the city. And this chart shows the share of eviction filings broken down by ward. So in Ward 8, 1 out of every 4 renter households received an eviction filing in 2018. In contrast, you can see that the share of renter households receiving filings in Wards 2 and 3 are dramatically lower. Next slide. Now within Wards 2, we find eviction hotspots in a handful of neighborhoods. And this map shows the share of households in a census tract that received at least 1 eviction filing in 2018. In the neighborhoods with the highest concentration of eviction filings, these are shown in the darkest green. These are areas where 40% or more of renter households were impacted by the eviction process. Additionally, by showing the map alongside the map, the green map alongside the map of racial composition, showing the share of Black households in a neighborhood, you can see how eviction filings are geographically related to racial segregation in the district. And I'll note that these maps, this map is for eviction filing, but we mapped it also with executed evictions, and the geographic patterns look fairly similar. Now on the next slide, when tenants are summoned to court, they often owe just small sums of money to their landlords. So on average, they owe around $1,200 at the time an eviction suit is filed. And it's important to note that 12% of renters summoned to court in the district owe less than $600. Also, nearly 2/3 of households owe less than the citywide median rent, which is about $1,500 when they're summoned to court. By the time a tenant makes it to eviction, the median renter owes over $2,200, nearly twice the average at the beginning of the filing process. This is because by the time the eviction filing works its way through the court system, tenants are even more in debt due to a combination of court fees and sometimes rent withheld. There's some clear policy implications here that we can talk about at the end. Next slide. So we also examine the question of who files for eviction. While there were 31,000 eviction filings in 2018, these filings were disproportionately concentrated in the hands of just a small number of landlords. So if you look at the darkest blue stripe on the bottom left, this shows the concentration of eviction filings among the 10 landlords with the most filings in 2018. These 10 landlords filed 37% of all eviction filings in the city. Correspondingly, on the right, the darkest blue bar at the bottom shows the share of residential units owned by these same 10 landlords. They own only 16% of all residential units in the city. Similarly, the top 20 landlords were responsible for nearly half of all filings, but owned only 21% of total units. In other words, the largest landlords in the city are filing disproportionately relative to the number of units that they own. Now, in part, this is of course due to the fact that landlords who rent to lower income tenants may be facing non-paying tenants more frequently, as they're the ones providing housing to the tenants with the least ability to pay. However, we also ran this analysis looking just within wards 7 and 8, where renters are lower income than in other parts of the city. And here too, even just within these areas, we find that larger landlords tend to file for eviction disproportionately to the properties they own and at much higher rates than smaller landlords. This is in line with previous research on property owners, suggesting that as a policy, larger landlords often want to file on their tenants immediately after rent is due, submitting bulk filings for every unit where rent is owed, often before reaching out to the tenant directly to find out what's going on, why rent is late, and when they can expect it. So this analysis too really points to an over-reliance on the court system in cases where an informal conversation might do a lot to keep tenants out of court and their names out of the eviction record system, especially in cases where rent is coming, it's just late. Next slide. So on the question of legal representation, previous research clearly shows that having legal representation benefits both landlords and tenants. Even in straightforward cases where a tenant owes the rent, which is the majority of cases, having a lawyer can help ensure a fair process for everyone. So for example, sometimes tenants withhold rent when there are quality concerns, and having legal counsel can ensure that tenants' counterclaims are properly heard. Our analysis shows that nearly all property owners are represented by a lawyer. In contrast, very few tenants have representation, and this is in a city that has invested a ton of money in right to counsel. So tenants arrived in court represented by an attorney in only 1.78% of cases. In an additional 1 to 3% of cases, a tenant gets day of legal representation through the Tenant Resource Center for their case. Next slide. Now, finally, a word about filing fees. Here we plotted the filing fees for the 50 largest cities in the US, and it's clear that DC is a bit of an outlier here. You can see it on the upper left. It's not as much of an outlier as Detroit, but it is on the upper left. So we see, so DC has the lowest filing fee and one of the higher filing rates. And we see a strong correlation between the cost of filing for an eviction and the rate of eviction filings. Where it's more expensive to file for an eviction, landlords tend to file at lower rates. Where it's less expensive to file for an eviction, landlords tend to file at much higher rates. In this way, the institutional practices of the court appear to be related to how many eviction filings are made against tenants. The DC City Council has recently recommended that the court raise the filing fee from just $15, the lowest in the country, to $100, which is more in line with the median filing fee in other large US cities. The big concern here, of course, is whether or not this fee will be passed along to tenants, and that's something that advocates are working on now. Next slide. So this is my last slide on policy implications. And I think there's, of course, a range of different types of policy approaches we can think of when it comes to eviction. They range from preventative solutions to Band-Aid solutions to more systemic approaches. And I'll highlight just a few of the big approaches and implications that we think come out of these findings. So first, our results show that eviction prevention is an economic and racial justice issue. As I mentioned, we find that 60% of filings take place in wards 7 and 8, suggesting just how disproportionately the eviction process impacts low-income DC residents and renters of color. We should think about targeting aid to these populations, making sure that resources and information are available right in the communities that need them. Second, we argue that landlord-side interventions provide an important stopgap measure before an eviction suit is filed. And this would actually be a really interesting topic to sort of target to this particular audience and think about what does that actually mean for housing authorities as opposed to private landlords. So we typically, of course, talk about interventions that target tenants. In this report, we're also advocating for solutions that target landlords. As we've shown, quite a small number of landlords are responsible for a large number of filings. If we could theoretically pull these 20 landlords into a room and have a conversation, we think perhaps really interesting things could happen. Now, access to legal counsel, of course, helps to level the playing field for tenants facing eviction. Then record sealing is essential for mitigating eviction stigma and preventing harm to tenants. As I mentioned at the beginning, the council has taken some steps to begin record sealing. They have an emergency bill in place. We think that this could do a lot to help tenants' records stay clean and to allow them to be easier to find housing in the future. But we also want to keep the data open to researchers and legal advocates. So we're hoping to find a solution there. Now, of course, emergency rental assistance can be an incredible tool of eviction prevention. DC has a very robust emergency rental assistance program called ERAP that's been really expanded quite a lot during the pandemic. And I'm happy to talk more about what that has looked like. We've, of course, like many other places, received a combination of local and federal funds. The big trick with a program like ERAP is to figure out how to get it to the people who need it. So there's more people who need it than there is money, but there's also really a lot of undersubscription, suggesting that people are having trouble with the application and having trouble getting the documentation that they need to qualify. Ultimately, though, if we want to solve the eviction crisis, we need to solve the affordable housing crisis. To this end, we talk a lot in the report about expanding long-term subsidized housing as the most effective tool to combat housing insecurity. So thank you guys so much. I look forward to your questions. And I just want to thank my co-author and collaborator, Brian McCabe, who worked on this report with me. And I'd be happy to put the link to the report in the chat for you all. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Eva. So now we'll move on to Kate.
Great. Hi, everyone.
Yeah, same here. Thanks.
Let's see. You seeing my slides?
Yep.
Great. So my name's Kate Leifheit. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. And today I'll be talking about the strength of eviction protections and population mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I don't think it will come as a surprise to anyone in this audience that housing insecurity is a well-established determinant of mental distress. And there's a growing body of research that suggests that evictions and the threat of evictions may be a particularly harmful form of housing insecurity. And of course, this is all coming to a head right now. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, inability to pay rent was a strong predictor of suicidal ideation. So, one of the most severe forms of mental distress. And during the pandemic, many states, so 43 states and the District of Columbia, implemented eviction moratoriums. And of course, the primary objective of these eviction moratoriums was to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So together with co-authors, I was able to demonstrate that these state-level eviction moratoriums appear to have been effective in preventing the spread of COVID-19. So we think that just over the summer, from June 1st to September 3rd, state-level eviction moratoriums might have prevented 830,000 cases of COVID and 39,000 deaths from COVID. So we think these are really powerful interventions against COVID-19. But of course, the question is, what other health effects might these moratoriums have had? And it's important to note that each state, sort of from one week to the next, had very different protections against evictions. which leads us to these research questions. So first of all, did COVID-19 eviction moratoriums have spillover effects on renters' mental distress? And second of all, what kinds of protections were the most consequential? And looking at these sort of time varying differences in the protections that states were providing against evictions allows us to learn more about how the process of eviction affects mental distress and potentially other health outcomes. So this will look pretty familiar, especially after Dr. Rosen's talk, but we generally think of the eviction process as a 5-stage one, beginning with notice and filing, and then ending with hearing and in the courthouse, a judgment, and ultimately enforcement. So a sheriff coming and removing folks from their homes. And eviction moratoriums throughout COVID have blocked anywhere from 1 to 5 of these stages of evictions. So what I'm calling a strong moratorium is an eviction moratorium that blocked the early stages, so notice and filing, and in doing so blocked the entire eviction process. So these strong moratoriums prevent displacement, of course, but by blocking notice and filing, they may also lessen sort of landlords' legal options for tenant harassment and prevent legal ramifications. So without that filing on their record, tenants may have sort of less long-lasting consequences of an eviction. So 25 states had those sort of strong eviction moratoriums. By contrast, a weak moratorium would have only blocked those latter stages of the process. So it allows landlords to file during the pandemic, but it blocks sort of the displacement and the court process. And 18 states had these weak moratoriums. I should also say that moratoriums varied with respect to scope. So some states restricted their moratoriums to people who could demonstrate COVID-19 related hardship. And of course, that involves a lot of administrative burden in documenting that you're not able to pay rent because of COVID-19 related hardship. Another common restriction was restricting the moratoriums to non-payment of rent. So to get at this question of how this variation in moratorium strength affected renters' mental health, we use data from the Understanding America survey, which is an online nationally representative panel survey administered by USC. And they've been collecting data since the beginning of March 2020 up through the present. And it's really wonderful because it's publicly available data that gets posted online. About every 2 weeks it's updated. And for the purposes of our study, we limit our sample to renters with baseline household income below $75,000 a year. And we limit it also to surveys completed prior to the CDC's moratorium in September of 2020. The reason for that is because we're really trying to look at this state level variation. The outcome that we're looking at is moderate or severe mental distress in the past 2 weeks. To measure that, we use a 4-item patient health questionnaire score of 6 or higher. It asks lots of questions about sort of symptoms of distress experienced in the last 2 weeks. And our exposure, again, is this time varying moratorium protection. So whether the moratorium was strong, weak, or non-existent. And then we control for a number of things that we know might be associated both with the kinds of eviction protections that states were offering, as well as renters' levels of mental distress. So first of all, how bad was COVID at the time the survey was completed? So we control for COVID incidence and mortality. We control for unemployment to kind of get a measure of economic conditions at the time, shelter-in-place orders and school closures to think about kind of social disruptions going on with the pandemic. And we also include fixed effects for time and individual. So this is a way at sort of controlling for temporal trends, time trends in mental distress, as well as sort of individual level factors that might be different between people that live in states with strong versus weak moratoriums. And here's sort of a description of moratorium coverage in our sample. So it's about 2,300 individuals that completed on average 9 surveys during the study period. In gray here is no moratorium. So in early March, as you would expect, almost no survey respondents were covered by an eviction moratorium. But then we see this sort of dip in April, May, suggesting that people really were protected by a moratorium, especially in the spring. So April, May, June, and then we see this tapering off. So in June, July, August, we see less and less protection from moratoriums. And by the end of the study in early September, really very few, it looks like about 20% of respondents had coverage from a strong moratorium, and around half had any moratorium coverage at all. And so then when we look at the prevalence of mental distress adjusted for the factors that I mentioned before, we see that on average, people living in states with no moratorium protection have 17.7% of those people have moderate or severe mental distress. For folks in states with a weak moratorium, it's a bit lower. It's 17% of those have mental distress. And then for folks living in a state with a strong moratorium, we see that the prevalence is even lower at 15.5%. And so that first difference between no moratorium and a weak moratorium, it turns out is not statistically significant. On the other hand, this over 2% reduction in mental distress between a no moratorium and a strong moratorium is statistically significant. We also conducted a number of secondary analyses, and we found that these protective effects of strong moratoriums were the most pronounced when moratoriums were not restricted to COVID-19 financial hardship. In other words, more open moratoriums that were easier for folks to access. And then also more pronounced when states had high rates of rental cost burden prior to COVID. In other words, if you live in a state where you're likely to be spending a high proportion of your income on rent to begin with, even prior to COVID-19, these strong moratoriums seem to have strong protective effects on mental health. So in other words, the people that might really need an eviction moratorium are feeling those protective benefits. So we conclude that strong moratoriums reduced mental distress, whereas weak ones did not. And this is consistent with sort of the qualitative research on evictions and this idea that sort of early in the process, when you get that filing and you know that you're going to have an eviction on your record, that's really when the damages begin. However, reductions were modest. So this 2% reduction on the population level, I don't want to undersell it. That's not nothing, but the fact that it's a little bit small might be due to multiple concurrent stressors. In other words, we're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So the degree to which an eviction moratorium can reduce mental distress might be limited, just given that high baseline level of mental distress. Could also be that renters were not that aware of their protections under these eviction moratoriums. They're really complicated and they also vary a lot from day to day. So if folks don't really know what their protections are from one day to the next, then it would make sense that these sort of protective effects are hard to pick up. Also this idea of restricted scope of moratoriums. So the fact that maybe people didn't have a lot of faith that these moratoriums were going to protect them because of all the administrative burden involved in accessing them. In terms of policy, we see that these robust policies were able to help renters weather the pandemic. And it's important to note that these are state level protections, right? So even barring a robust federal moratorium, we see that states can step in to protect renters' mental health during this time. It's of course very timely because the CDC moratorium is due to expire soon. Implementation of the moratorium has been sort of spotty throughout, and it's currently under a lot of legal threat. At the same time, we've got all of this federal money coming in for rent relief, but states have been slow to roll it out, which means that we could be sort of seeing a situation brew where in the next couple months, we might see a spike in eviction filings and mental distress unless we see some quick policy interventions to prevent these things. But thinking beyond COVID, we can take this as further evidence that the harms wrought by evictions begin early in the process with notice and filing. And I think this sort of dovetails nicely with what Dr. Rosen just presented. And to me, this suggests a need for reforms to curtail filings, increasing the fees that landlords have to pay to be able to file for an eviction, expanding tenant rights, and of course, expanding the supply of affordable housing. So that's sort of the root cause that we all need to think about addressing if we're ever going to prevent eviction filings from happening. And with that, I wanted to thank everyone for having me, acknowledge my co-authors, Craig Pollack, Julia Rafeman, Gabe Schwartz, Emily Bemfer, Fred Zimmerman, and Sabria Linton. My funding and my Twitter handle and email are there. This work isn't yet published, but I can send a link to the COVID paper, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Kate. I see a few questions coming through in the chat, and so I am taking note of them, and I'll just hold them until we get through the presentations. But just because you mentioned the legal threats to the moratorium, and I see a comment about that in the chat, I can post an article to what came out today. Dory-Vet, are you ready to share? Great. Oh, I think you're muted.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? I can't tell what you see and what you don't see.
Yep, we can see it.
All right.
I can see it.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dory-Vet Nolan. I'm the Director of Policy Planning and Housing Mobility for the Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority. Just to tell you a little bit about us, we're located in Cleveland, Ohio. We are the first chartered housing authority in the country, established in 1933, no matter what anybody else tells you. At CMHA, we manage and operate over 10,000 affordable housing units through the public housing and RAD programs. And we also administer a little bit over 15,000 vouchers through Housing Choice Voucher. That makes us the 7th largest PHA in the nation. With those programs combined, we administer over 30 different waiting lists for housing, containing just under 100,000 applicants on those lists. I think this demonstrates a great need for affordable housing within our community. And I can tell you that our mission is to create safe, quality, affordable housing opportunities and improve the quality of life in the communities we serve. But at that mission statement, at its core, we're housers. And I believe it is our responsibility to our community to administer housing programs that provide stability. And we do this through work with our community partners, through development and programming, and of course, eviction prevention strategies. A little bit about eviction in Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. Prior to COVID-19, there were some 20,000 evictions filed annually in Cuyahoga County, with 9,000 of those eviction filings being just for the city of Cleveland itself. Case Western's Poverty Action Lab, the Poverty Center, I'm sorry, works to inform public policy and program planning through data and analysis to address urban policy, urban poverty, its causes, and its impact on communities and their residents. In 2019, the Poverty Center published 2 reports on tenant experiences leading up to eviction and the long-term impacts of eviction on these tenants and their families. And the studies found that a few interesting things. I mean, they were large studies, but most interesting was that most tenants in eviction court are low income, minority, female heads of households with children who are highly cost burdened. Most evictions are filed due to non-payment, and they're filed for like 1 or 2 months delinquent rent, with average amount owed to landlords being around $1,800. 47% of evictions were for households who were not related to public housing. Those led to an eviction move out order, compared to when a household did have some type of public housing or housing choice voucher assistance assigned to them, there would be a eviction order made to move out only about 33% of the time. Hearings in the city of Cleveland happen quickly. Often tenants do not attend, and the first cause hearing can last a mere 3 minutes. Many factors contribute to tenants being behind on their rent, including landlords refusing to take late payments or partial payments, withholding rents due to housing conditions and financial instability. The study also found that days spent in shelters are 60% higher for households with eviction orders than households without an eviction order. Additionally, use of homeless shelters is higher among households evicted from public housing. For this population, increased levels of homeless shelter use remain high even 2 years after the eviction. These studies and others like them have been used to bolster advocacy efforts for eviction prevention policies in Cleveland, such as those supported by our Fair Housing Working Group. The Fair Housing Working Group, CMHA is a member of this group. Shout out to Enterprise Community Partners for putting us together. This group is comprised of several different stakeholders in Cuyahoga County who have all come together to address issues affecting fair housing within our county. The working group has supported and advocated for various policies that prevent eviction, including right to counsel in the city of Cleveland, pay to stay ordinances, and source of income. Under right to counsel in 2019, Cleveland became the first Midwest city to pass a right to counsel ordinance. This ordinance was passed with the recognition that a lack of legal counsel is prevalent amongst low-income tenants. This program provides tenants facing eviction with one or more child living at or below the poverty level access to free legal representation in housing court. And access to quality legal representation can prevent the negative impacts of evictions. This program is delivered through a partnership between Legal Aid Society of Cleveland and the United Way. It began in July 2020. And in the first 6 months of this program, it is found that 93% of right to counsel clients seeking to avoid eviction were able to achieve this outcome using this program. Under pay to stay legislation, existing Ohio law says that a landlord has no duty to accept a late payment from a renter. Proposed pay to stay legislation would require owners to accept late payments offered to avoid an eviction judgment. Without pay to stay protections, any landlord can evict a tenant for being just 1 day late on their rent. And because of work of advocates and the Fair Housing Working Group, pay to stay legislation is actually being considered in several Cuyahoga County municipalities. And then we have source of income legislation. Source of income refers to the tenant's source of rent payment. And it's usually payment from rent subsidies like the housing choice voucher or other public assistance like disability benefits or supplemental security income. An example of source of income discrimination is when landlords specifically say no Section 8 on their rental advertisements. So under this type of discrimination, it can serve as a form of racial discrimination since many participants of voucher families are actually families that are minorities. This discrimination is currently legal in many cities throughout Cuyahoga County, and it serves as a barrier for families seeking to secure safe, decent, affordable housing. Through legislation, it would make source of income discrimination a protected class under the fair housing laws in the county or the city of Cleveland. 17 states have already passed statewide protections for source of income. And in Ohio, 7 cities have source of income protections. And through work of this Fair Housing Group, legislation is currently being considered in the city of Cleveland. Next, I'll talk a little bit about our prevention and experience. I'm sorry, I'm flipping 2 slides, yeah. Okay. Under our CMHA policy, we understand that the impacts of eviction are more severe for families evicted from public housing or assisted housing. So we prioritize working with the families to prevent eviction in the first place. We try to work our programs. So tenants that are subject to minimum rent who qualify are offered a hardship exemption. Whether it's short-term or long-term, the exemption is one of the tools in our toolbox to help ease the burden, the rent burden that the family might be experiencing in a time of hardship. Additionally, CMHA staff work with families who have past due balances to determine the best method to assist the household in maintaining stable housing. Many families are offered a repayment agreement for past due balances. Families are asked to provide a down payment. It can be as little as 10% of the balance owed. And together with the family, a staff member determines the amount to be repaid on a monthly basis and the amount of time that the repayment agreement will last. But in either case, the repayment amount is added to the monthly rent amount, but we make sure that the total out-of-pocket cost for the family is no more than 40% of their adjusted monthly income. Another method we use to address past due balances is through our interim certifications. While it's second nature to some participant families to let us know immediately when there have been changes in their household income or expenses, we found that some families, they're just not reporting these changes and instead just struggling to try to make ends meet or not paying the rent at all. So we've been making a concerted effort to work with families who have a past due balance. We reach out to them to ask if there's been any changes. And then we work with them to obtain proper documentation that we need to calculate the rent based on their current circumstances and reduce their burden, as is intended by, our housing programs. When all other methods fail and we must file for eviction, we still work with the tenants as much as we can, even in housing court. For example, in 2018, public housing managers began the process of eviction on some 1,800 tenants. Of those, only 900 were actually filed in court. And of those 900, only 500 actually resulted in an eviction. This is echoed by findings from the Cleveland eviction studies done by the Poverty Lab, which found that only 47% of evictions not related to public housing led to a move-out order, but for cases related to public housing, only 33% of those led to a move-out order. We also have an approach to addressing landlord and tenant issues within the Housing Choice Voucher Program. We created the position of Landlord Outreach Coordinator in 2019, and the coordinator serves as a point of contact for existing and prospective landlords. The coordinator is also responsible for helping landlords navigate the Housing Choice Voucher Program, as well as mediating landlord and tenant issues. Since landlords are provided with a full range of options through the coordinator to address issues of concern, but eviction is seen as the last resort for her. And I think by providing landlords with a direct line, a person that they can talk to about the issues they're facing, we hope that HCVP participants in Cuyahoga County can more effectively utilize their voucher. We've also done some work with the Eviction Lab. In 2019, we were invited to participate in a qualitative research study on landlord and tenant dynamics in America, conducted by researchers from Princeton and the Eviction Lab. A researcher from the Eviction Lab reached out to us asking if they could interview a few staff members who work closely with our residents, hoping to gain insight from different perspectives on evictions and how we make decisions about the evictions. The researcher spent a little over a week in the city of Cleveland conducting research on many different things. She attended a resident meeting. She attended our board meeting. She walked around our developments talking to residents. She spent days at housing court interviewing tenants as they went in and out of the proceedings. She also spent a full day interviewing CMHA staff members. We all signed a consent form and agreed to be recorded. I, being the policy director, collected all this data on our evictions and what we had done and what we hadn't done. But I didn't need any of that. The researcher was interested in the stories about eviction. She didn't want to talk to me about our data. She wanted the real life experiences from our property managers and resident services managers about the families and the people involved, what we thought, how we felt our decisions were made, like what our thought process was and how the outcome may have affected the family. Like, was the family still in housing? Did they move out? I remember she began several of her questions with, was there ever a time that such and such happened? And when our property manager would answer yes, she would follow up with, can you tell me more about that? And then it would just evolve into a story. It was an interesting experience and we hope to see the outcome soon, but the report hasn't been published yet. So our experiences with eviction during COVID-19, the Cleveland Municipal Housing Court suspended all eviction hearings and eviction move-outs. So they were closed from March 18, 2020 to June 15, 2020. This policy reduced filings to near zero until June 15th, and then filings have remained below historical averages. And you can see, I'll detail this a little bit more in the next slide, but the filings for April were 70% below the average. In this slide, you can see that eviction filings have been about half what they typically were pre-pandemic. And some experts actually fear that this may be due to a backlog of findings or pending filings, which would mean that an influx of eviction filings could hit our area soon. So we continue to work with the county government and local government to allocate funds to ensure that we have this rental assistance provided to our, not just our residents, but also public housing choice voucher participants with past due balances to maintain that housing stability. So Cuyahoga County and the city of Cleveland have responded to economic impacts of the pandemic of tenants. The city, county, and state developed programs to help families economically impacted by the pandemic. In Cuyahoga County, the Northeast Ohio Rent Help Program was created with funding, both local and federal, and CARES Act funding. Qualified applicants are able to receive up to 12 months rental assistance, and the program is administered by local nonprofit organizations. As of December 2020, $3.8 million of rent relief had been distributed within the county, preserving the income of landlords and housing for families. CMHA helped referred tenants and also helped tenants complete applications for this emergency rental assistance. CMHA was the second highest referral agency for rental assistance in the county, right behind United Way. We helped CMHA residents receive about $150,000 in rental assistance. In addition to our existing policy, we have suspended evictions for non-payment of rent in CMHA-owned properties. And since the courts opened, CMHA has only filed evictions for egregious violations of the lease related to life safety issues. To assist tenants with accumulating rent balances, we've opened our computer labs and dedicated staff members to completing rental assistance applications. Our team has managed to reach out to tenants. Our management team has reached out to tenants with past due balances to offer repayment agreements and interims and other policy related efforts, family sites opened virtual learning pods where children could attend school during the day so their parents could still go to work. And we've started waiving down payments on all repayment agreements so that you could easily enter into a repayment agreement. And we continue to work to identify and connect residents with community organizations and networks that may be able to provide them assistance. Thank you for having me today. A big thank you to Alexandra Tyler, our Mobility and Landlord Outreach Coordinator, who is the co-creator of this presentation today. Thanks again.
Thanks, Dorivette. So I'll turn it over to Taylor.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Can you all see my screen here?
Yep, that looks great.
Great. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Smiley Wolf. I'm the Director of Policy and Planning at Home Forward. We are the housing authority for Multnomah County, which is where the city of Portland is located. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, which is on the occupied lands of the Clackamas, Cowlitz, and Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. So today, I'm going to be talking about a study that Home Forward commissioned to look at evictions across our portfolio prior to COVID, which is informing a comprehensive policy strategy that we're currently engaging to develop to prevent evictions in general. I would also love to talk with you about some eviction prevention work that we're doing related to COVID and the debt that folks have accumulated during the pandemic, and then talk just a little bit about some needed federal changes that we see at Home Forward to help us prevent evictions more effectively as housing authorities. So starting with our eviction study, we looked at data from, commissioned a study to look at data from 2018 to 2019. A little bit of background about us during the study period, we own about 6,000 units. More than half of them are subsidized, 46% are unsubsidized. And in the unsubsidized units, there are about 24% of folks that have some form of a tenant-based subsidy, but the vast majority of households that are living in unsubsidized affordable units are don't have any subsidy at all, meaning that if they experience a loss of income, their rent cannot be adjusted. And these are the households that we have been most concerned about during the pandemic and in general, who don't have that safety net in the case that their income changes, they're not able to have their portion of the rent change. So Home Forward, our portfolio of properties is managed by 6 different property management companies. We have an internal property management company that is mission driven and manages about 40% of all of our units, and then 5 other companies that some work with specific populations, folks who have co-occurring substance use and mental health issues, and then some property management companies are predominantly operating private rentals in the market. So we have quite a range of folks that we work with. So the study, I want to acknowledge and thank Nicole Updegrove, who is a Master of Public Policy candidate from UC Berkeley, who did this report for us and did an amazing job. She looked at eviction data from legal proceedings from our attorney during the study period, which again was from 2018 to 2019. And she was also able to link up this data with our internal demographic data to do an analysis of potential racial disparities. The reason that we commissioned this study is because as an agency, we want to understand the rate of eviction filings and the reason for eviction filings across the portfolio as a starting point to develop strategies to reduce evictions and promote housing stability. So we know that we're not alone and that many housing authorities may have multiple property management companies, but don't always track eviction data in their external or third-party managed properties. Those companies tend to manage, I would say, generally speaking, the sort of unsubsidized LIHTC portfolio. All right, so just some quick definitions before I move into the findings of the study. So there's the eviction filing rate, which is the number of evictions that are filed every year for 100 rentable units. The eviction vacate rate, so this is the number of tenants who actually vacate their unit after an eviction has been filed. And then the eviction judgment rate, which is the number of eviction judgments that are issued against tenants each year for 100 rentable units. All right, so the findings, and this lines up with a lot of the data and research that was shared earlier by Eva in terms of types of evictions and trends in general. So our eviction rate is 2 households per 100 units per year, and eviction rates vary by property management company. So you can see in this slide that we were able to compare our filing rate and our judgment rate to the county as a whole, And we were able to differentiate between our internally managed properties and our externally managed properties. In terms of findings, the majority of evictions were for past due charges. This lines up with what other presenters have shared. So almost 67% of all eviction filings were for non-payment of rent, which we see as a problem. We're providing affordable housing to folks, and if the primary reason that people are experiencing eviction from affordable housing is because they can't afford it, we know that something is structurally wrong. We also found that there were statistically significant differences in the reason for eviction filing by property management companies. So again, a mission-driven property management company, we saw a higher share of evictions related to housekeeping, extreme or outrageous acts, pest control failure. And in third-party managed properties, there was a statistically significant higher share of eviction filings for past due charges, unauthorized guests, and property damage. Under, again, in alignment with the research that Eva provided, under half of eviction filings actually resulted in a resident vacating the unit. So 39% of the time, the tenant remained in good standing, most often with a stipulated agreement. And again, this kind of demonstrates that oftentimes evictions can be filed as a method of essentially collecting past due rent, and the stipulated agreement can outline a repayment agreement. And 46% of the time, the tenant would vacate the unit. We found that eviction filings were more likely to result in a tenant vacating the unit if the filing was for a non-rent related reason, which again is a sign that the filings themselves were a mechanism to get folks to be current on their rent. And then finally, the study did not identify racial disparities, but we also didn't have a 100% demographic data match. I think we were able to achieve about an 87% match with our legal data and our demographic data. So we're working on improving that. But Eva already shared this research, but we know that nationally evictions disproportionately impact and harm Black and Latinx households. So although we didn't find these disparities in our data, we are very conscious about ensuring that the strategies we develop are using a racial equity framework and are advancing racial equity. So in terms of our next steps about eviction overall, Home Forward is in the process of developing a comprehensive policy strategy in close collaboration with our residents and participants to prevent evictions across our portfolio in a way that advances racial equity and housing stability. So specifically, if we find racial disparities when improving our demographic data quality, eliminating them and advancing equity and housing stability, preventing evictions that are not necessary to protect health and safety, so especially for non-payment of rent, and reducing evictions related to health and safety to the greatest extent possible. So we know that this may mean a large investment in services and trying to access local resources related to service funding and supports. And then finally, I'm not sure how many PHAs on the call have multiple property management companies, but we are endeavoring to create a system-wide policy around eviction, so progressive and trauma-informed lease enforcement practices, and having our third-party property management companies kind of align with our mission-driven approach around property management. So this is a large body of work that will likely take us multiple years. Okay, so transitioning to eviction prevention during COVID. So Home Forward has engaged in a number of strategies to prevent evictions due to non-payment of rent during the pandemic. So like everyone else, we're subject to the federal moratorium, but we actually have, I believe, one of the strong state moratoriums that Catherine described, which ends on June 30th, 2021. So coming up quickly here. So starting July 1, tenants who can't pay their base rent are vulnerable to eviction. There's also a bill in the state legislature, Senate Bill 282, which has passed the Senate and, knock on wood, is likely to pass in the House as well. And this bill would provide a grace period for tenants with rent arrears. So if folks have debt from the emergency period, which is defined between April and June 30th, they may not be evicted for those arrears until February 28th, 2022. So giving folks some time to pay back their rent. So in terms of our data about who we know in our housing who's been impacted by COVID, it matches up with, again, national trends. We've seen that a majority of households, a majority of households that have reported a loss of income have not received unemployment insurance. So in Oregon, we've had some challenges with unemployment rollout, but this just speaks to a gap here. So you can see that of 891 households who've reported a loss of income, that 667 of them have not had unemployment income. And we've seen in our subsidized portfolio about 7.3% of all households have reported a loss of income. And this is the piece that aligns with federal data and statewide data that we've seen that Black, Latinx, and Hawaiian Pacific Islander households have disproportionately experienced a loss of income related to the pandemic, as well as households with children. And I'm happy to send out these slides. I know there are a lot of numbers on each of these, but thought it would be helpful. So I'm sure everyone is employing this strategy, which we've been encouraged to do by HUD and is important, but encouraging folks to get an income recertification if they have experienced a loss of income. So this chart just shows how that's happened over time for us. And we are now, our monthly subsidy payment has increased by almost $300,000 a month as a result of the loss, the income that has been lost by the households that we serve. And we have folks that have been continuing to report losses of income due to COVID as recently as last month. Our second strategy is supporting all households, not just subsidized, but all households who have rent arrears. So the way that we have done that as an agency is that we waived all rent debt that households had from calendar year 2020. We were able to do that because we accessed some public funds to cover a portion of the rent. We didn't access public funds for 100% of it, but we committed to waiving rent arrears for calendar 2021 for all households regardless. We're in the process of applying to public funds to cover rent arrears from 2021. So in Oregon, we have a landlord compensation fund that was created by the legislature that actually PHAs around the state are helping to administer. And we're also eligible to apply for that fund, which we're doing on behalf of all of our residents who have rent arrears. We are offering folks affordable repayment agreements. So once the moratorium and grace period end, we are going to work with households to come up with a repayment agreement that works for them. With a potential minimum payment. And then we are also, once the moratorium ends on July 1st, we are not going to resume lease enforcement. We haven't yet chosen a date by which we will do that, but instead we're going to proactively reach out and offer staff support and potential contracted support to help people apply for tenant-based rental assistance that's available. So we are going to delay resuming lease enforcement for non-payment because we know that on July 1, households, given that many states are still in some form of shutdown, are not going to have their employment completely back. An outstanding challenge, and I'm curious to hear how other folks have dealt with this, is on strategies for households that don't have any form of subsidy and who aren't going to be able to afford their monthly rent when the moratorium ends. So again, for us, we're delaying lease enforcement and trying to help connect these households to tenant-based rent assistance. But for folks who experience longer-term loss of income, the vouchers that were provided by the federal government weren't sufficient to meet the need. And so we're really looking for strategies to help support folks in that circumstance. So lastly, in all of our work around eviction prevention, there are some key federal strategies that we would love to see in the future that I just wanted to raise with all of you. I know that this is a common one for the Eviction Lab, but providing subsidy to every eligible household. We only know that 1 in 4 households eligible for rent assistance receive it. So we need to make sure that we're expanding rental assistance options. But even then, there are improvements that could be made to help because we know that even folks with vouchers can experience eviction for non-payment. So some strategies that we've been thinking about to reduce shelter burden for subsidized households would require increasing per voucher funding, but increasing the payment standards or considering requiring rent reasonableness only as opposed to rent reasonableness and a payment standard. We've been thinking a lot about reconsidering the definition of affordability. We know this is a federal issue, but frankly, 30% of income is not affordable for extremely low income and very low income households. And we see folks that are experiencing shelter burden in the tenant program. And then eliminating minimum rents. We at Home Forward currently have minimum rents, or in the process of considering eliminating those. And then finally, supportive service funding to prevent evictions, especially for residents with mental and behavioral health challenges. So these are all strategies that we're interested in supporting and seeing those move forward. So thank you very much. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Taylor. And so I have a couple, I'll keep an eye on the chat, but I had a couple of questions for the panelists before we wrap up. I do this every time where I wonder how we're going to fill the entire time in the panel. And of course we do. So just a few questions. Well, I guess just one for each of you. So Eva, you mentioned ERAP, or the TC's version. So I wonder if you could just talk briefly about that and what, this might be a bit premature, but what do you think we're learning from these programs that maybe we could think about making sort of be a permanent part of eviction prevention in terms of emergency rent assistance?
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, great questions. A couple of things. So one of the biggest challenges is the one I mentioned, which is around documentation. It's very hard for poor families to get all of the paperwork that they often need to get approved for these kinds of things. In some cities and some states and with some of these programs, a writ of eviction is actually required. So the eviction has to be imminent. That makes sense in that we want to give aid to the people who are most at risk of losing their homes. But it doesn't make sense because what it actually does is it drives up the writs. So it actually forces a tenant to go to court and get the writ before they can get the emergency rental assistance. And as we know, having that record, having that filing on their record is incredibly detrimental to their ability to get a home in the future. And so the earlier in the process that we can get them this emergency rental assistance with the least administrative burden possible, is going to be the best for tenants, and it's going to save money in the long term. And I think what that points to me is actually the fact that we should be thinking about aid that, and I said this, but that comes before the stage of emergency rental assistance. So of course, how can we actually expand affordable housing programs and subsidies in a way that obviates the need for them to have to get rental assistance at all. But that being said, there are always going to be people who need help at that late stage. And I think that as we think about where to spend our money, right, we can spend our money on preventative measures, we can spend our money on emergency rental assistance programs, we can spend our money on right to counsel. And I would never say that we should only do one or the other, but I do think right by the time the person is in the courtroom, there's a lot less room to move. And so to the degree that we can help them earlier on, everyone's going to be better off. So reducing burden in terms of paperwork and then getting that money out as early as possible with as few requirements as possible. And that's something DC is actually increasingly talking more about. But this sort of remains to be implemented in a way that really works, I think.
Thanks. And so a question for Kate that had come up in the chat was, I think a question that a lot of people have had is how much do renters know about the moratorium and their rights underneath it and what they need to do in order to be protected by it? So has there really been any way so far to really assess that?
I don't know of any way to assess that. It would be really interesting to know, because I think this has been a really interesting period with a lot of state and local, and as we saw, even like PHA level policy making around around evictions. And so it would be really great to know how much tenants know about it, and so for the future we can figure out ways to maybe increase awareness of these policies. I think the results from our study might suggest that people don't know that much about the protections, because, again, we're really only seeing significant effects of relatively strong moratoriums, and even then they're sort of modest. So, you would think that if somebody knows a lot about their protections and knows that they can't be evicted, that should matter for mental health. And we see that it does, but it's not huge.
Right. And I did see that somebody put in the chat a link to the HUD's eviction prevention toolkit, and that does include some flyers letting residents know about the moratorium. And so just a question for both Dorivette and Taylor. So could you talk a little bit about how your approach to eviction prevention differs between your programs, especially between public housing and the voucher program? I saw that we had a question about, like, do PHAs know when voucher holders are paying rent late? Is it harder to get to be involved in eviction prevention on the voucher side?
Thanks, Emily. Yes, definitely. Like, on the public housing side, obviously, we're the owners, we're also the landlords, since we manage our full portfolio. So we control that action. But on the Housing Choice Voucher Program, our strategy was more to inform the tenants, to let them know what their rights were. So we did several rave calls, which are like just robocalls to the participants about what their rights were, right to counsel, and how they could contact the Northeast Ohio Rent help center, and then also through social media, letting them know. And then for our landlords, same thing. We did the robocall, like, did you know your tenant could get this? And, you know, on the flip side, you get the money, right? If they get these emergency assistance, the landlord gets his rent paid. So the information was shared with both parties so that they could be aware of what's going on. And then anytime someone reaches out to our landlord outreach coordinator, she is reinforcing this message. Like, it doesn't have to go to eviction. You don't have to not have money. There are places, there is a way to get help.
And then we similarly do not have the same, because voucher holders are typically in the private market, ability to interrupt the landlord-tenant challenges they may be having with their landlord. But what we are talking about in the context of COVID-related arrears is providing some staff capacity to do some outreach to tenant-based voucher holders who may have rent arrears and help connect them to tenant-based rental assistance if they need, because we know that for emergency payments that are eviction prevention specific, voucher holders are able to access short-term emergency rent assistance. So helping to connect folks to that is something that we're currently contemplating and makes sense, I think, to continue into the future if possible.
Great, thanks. And I just did see one more question for you, Taylor, which was about waiving rent. So, so for the waiver, what was the response from residents who did maintain timely payments in 2020?
Yeah, so we had some conversations with our resident advisory bodies that we have at Home Forward about this strategy before moving forward, and people were generally happy to hear that their neighbors were not going to have debt that they couldn't afford that may put them at risk for eviction.
Great, thanks. And so I'll stop there because we're over time, but I did see a few questions about the PowerPoint slides, and we will be sending that out along with the recording to everyone who registered. So you should receive that. And so thanks to our 4 panelists. We really appreciate you taking the time, and thanks for all of the great information. And so we'll end here.
Thank you.